I'd like to share just briefly about my story. I was born in an American city called Detroit. This city of Detroit looked like this when I was a small child. You've heard about riots that took place across the United States within the last 12 months or so. As bad as those were, all together, they were not as bad as the riots that took place in Detroit when I was a small child. So I grew up in an environment that was quite unstable. It was very difficult. I was offered hard drugs for the first time at 7 years of age. I remember cowering under my bed at the sound of gunshots in the street. I remember the body of a heroin overdose victim being wheeled out of the house across the street. And my parents, having not grown up in this environment, they just got out as soon as they could. When I was about 10 years of age, my family moved to a town in the very center, the heart of America, called Great Bend, Kansas. This is a picture of Great Bend during the busiest hour of the day. So that'll give you some idea of the difference. It was quite a culture shock to go from a city of 1.7 million people to a town of 17,000 people, from a church of 2,000 people to a church that was so small that our family of four increased attendance by 20% just by walking through the door. And it was a wonderful place to grow up, wonderful place to spend my teenage years. But it was also not a place where I could get answers to many of the difficult questions I was asking. I was very curious. I wanted to know, how do we know there is a God? How do we know that God is as described in the Bible? How do we know the Bible is reliable? What about evolution? What about philosophers like Nietzsche and so forth? And because I was not getting answers to those kinds of questions, because most of the people in our tiny church, their faith journey did not take them through the streets of difficult questions like that, I basically decided that when I graduated high school, I was going to graduate from church at the same time. My parents, having realized this, arranged for me to attend a program in Manitou Springs, Colorado called Summit Ministries. The program is located in this antique hotel. It's right next door to where I am sitting at this moment. And I walked right into the place, walked right up to the director of the program, Dr. David Noble. And I said to him, I hope you have a lot of answers because I have a lot of questions. I was all of 17 at the time and very self-assured. David Noble could have said to me, look, kid, don't worry. We can answer all of your questions. Or don't be so arrogant. There are a lot of people who've done a lot of thinking about the Bible. And so don't worry about all of it. But he didn't say that to me. He said instead, at Summit, we aren't afraid of questions. I realized at that moment how significant that was, because I didn't expect anyone to have all the answers to all of my questions. But I did hope to find a community of people where my questions would be taken seriously. And today, irony of ironies, I have the privilege of being the president of that very program and providing that kind of instruction now to about, there were 35 students in my Summit Ministry session. This year, we'll have the opportunity to reach out to 50,000 young people. And we do that through in-person programs, through virtual courses that people all over the world can participate in. We also do that through curriculum courses that we offer to churches and Christian schools and homeschool groups. But it's a critically important time in which we live. I mean, every place we go, we see people who are upset with the way things are going. Thoughts and prayers don't save lives. Gun reform will was one protest that I saw. No bans, no walls. This kind of thing is a regular occurrence in our context. And in the particular town where I live, which is kind of known as a hippie community, little Colorado community, people tend to express their viewpoint through stickers they put on the back of their car. Here's an example. This person has had several thoughts in his or her lifetime, and they're all posted right there on the back of the car. As I've thought about that, I realized these stickers are not put on the back of someone's car to invite conversation. They're put on there to foreclose conversation. This is a settled issue. If you don't see it my way, you are less than intelligent. Perhaps you ought to even be shamed for what you believe that is in disagreement with what I hold to be true. At Summit Ministries, our aim is to open up conversations, not to close them down, to invite people to feel safe to think rather than inviting them to feel ashamed of what they have thought. And it's more and more important these days as the young adults we're working with embrace all kinds of assumptions about the world that are inconsistent with a biblical worldview. We've done a number of studies on this, and a lot of our studies are of church going, self identified Christian young people. Here are just some of the things that we've found recently. We found in one of our studies that 83% of Christian church attending millennials strongly agree or agree somewhat that the root of society's problem is that rich people exploit the system in a way that hurts the working class. 72% of Christian church attending millennials strongly agree or agree somewhat that meaning and purpose come from being one with all that is, kind of an Eastern assumption about the world. 63% of Christian church attending millennials strongly agree or agree somewhat that what is morally right and wrong changes over time based on society, that truth cannot really be known. 60% of Christian church attending millennials strongly agree or agree somewhat that no one can know for certain what meaning and purpose there is in life. 50% of Christian church attending millennials strongly agree or agree somewhat that the root of society's problem is failing to make society submit to God by force if necessary. Now, we can agree or disagree with any of these. And of course, in polling, it's always difficult to understand fully what someone means when they answer in a certain way. But I think what became clear to us is that young adults embrace all kinds of assumptions about the world that are at odds with one another, and that they would have a very difficult time drawing any kind of a clear line between the way they're thinking about the world and a way of thinking about the world that would be instructed through scripture or through the thinking of thoughtful Christians through history. So at Summit Ministries, we've asked the question, how do we reach out to a generation like this? And we've decided, and this is our approach as a Summit Ministries team with all of our instructors and all of our staff, to describe the world in the following way. The DNA of influence is two strands. It is truth and relationship. If you were to ask anyone who works at Summit Ministries, what is your job? They will tell you, before they tell you their job description, they will draw out a DNA double helix and say, my job is to make connections between truth and relationship. Those connecting nucleotides. My job is to make that connection for somebody every day. And truth and relationship, it's significant that they go together. And here's how we see it. Truth without relationship leads to arrogance. The most arrogant people I have ever met are people who are quite sure they are right and they do not care how anyone feels or processes through the things they're saying. They just say, take it or leave it. This is the way things are. On the other hand, relationship without truth leads to apathy. If your response to a difficult conversation is, well, you have your truth, I have my truth, or I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree, or let's talk about something else, very quickly realize that some of the most important things we could possibly communicate about are the very things that are left out of our conversations. And that leads people to be apathetic about the whole search for truth. But when you take truth and relationship and put them together, you change the environment. You can actually move people more toward the truth. Our approach at Summit Ministries is to think of it as sort of a baton relay, as in a track and field event. 2 Timothy 2:2, what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, Paul said, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. But what does that look like? In other sessions that I've done during the European Leadership Forum, we've talked about a biblical worldview, how to understand a biblical worldview, what a biblical worldview is, and how to communicate it to the rising generation. But in this session, I'd really like to focus on the relationship side of the equation. How do we connect with the hearts and minds of people who see the world in a very different way? I'd like to share two ways of doing that. First is gaining credibility, and second is hosting conversation. So credibility and conversation are really the two key points that I'd like to focus on. And here in a few minutes, I'll wrap up and we can have more of a conversation about that. But what we're finding is if you want to make connections across generations, you have to have a basis of credibility. This may seem a little bit ironic, but I tend to, when I think about credibility, go all the way back to Aristotle, who wrote the first book about public speaking, communication, and persuasion called The Rhetoric. In The Rhetoric, Aristotle said something that was really revolutionary, and I think still is revolutionary to this day. And it's this: if I'm giving a speaking session, I don't get to decide whether I am credible. That my credibility to the audience is in the minds of the people who are in the audience. That they will decide whether or not I should be listened to. And they will decide whether I should be listened to by how they can answer three questions. The first question, what Aristotle called ethos, is, are you a good person? I don't want to listen to you if I don't think that you are a good person who has my best interests at heart. People will say, I care about what you are saying to the degree that I see that you're the sort of person who is speaking because you really are seeking the truth, not just because you're seeking to gain power or advantage over me. One of the ways we try to build ethos in our program, and we have 75 different instructors who will work with our students throughout any given summer, any given group of students who would be here for a week virtually or through one of our in-person 2-week programs, we'd meet maybe 10 or 15 of those instructors. But our instructors all know that inviting conversation rather than merely answering the surface questions is at the heart of what makes this experience valuable. We teach our team 5 conversation altering words. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. So next week, I'll begin meeting with our students in a session we have that's going to be hosted in Phoenix, Arizona, on the campus of Arizona Christian University. And the students will be coming in with all kinds of assumptions about the world. They might say, well, I embrace socialism, or you are a racist, or I think you're a bigot because you believe that the Christian worldview is true, or things like that. It's really easy to want to snap off a response. And I've looked at a lot of the things the students are saying. I'm familiar with those sorts of conversations. But my first impulse, I believe, needs to be to listen and to hear and to open up the conversation rather than close it down. So when someone says, you're a bigot, aren't Christians bigots? Well, tell me more about that. That's an interesting statement that you would make. That's an awful lot to process. Tell me what you're thinking. And it turns out in the programs that we offer, in our experience, that when you begin by asking questions rather than simply trying to answer the question, the answers become more meaningful to the students we're working with. It helps them form out a more complete worldview. And I'll talk more about how that is the case, or what's behind that here in a few minutes. Second, Aristotle talked about pathos. The pathos question is, do you care? My students are inside, even though many of them won't come right out and say this. They're asking, what do you care about besides being right? Do you, does my story matter to you? And we wanted to be able to demonstrate caring. We'll do that through a lot of different things, but one of the things that we've trained our team to do is to be willing to talk about the talk. That it isn't just the subject matter that we're discussing, it is how we go about relating to one another that also is part of the equation. And our team knows that although most of the questions we've heard from our students, we have heard before, we can form answers to those, and we do. But we also want to communicate about the communication itself. So, for instance, uh, w- a lot of people will say, "Wow, when I hear a question from someone, it's about a faith issue that I'm not really sure how to engage." Go ahead and talk about the talk. Say something like, I feel tension right now because I think I'm supposed to have a snappy answer and I don't. Can I think about it and get back to you? Another example would be, I can see that we think very differently about this, but I want you to know that I care about you and I value your friendship. Both of those are pathos kind of responses. They communicate, yes, we will talk about tough things. I will hear your tough questions. I may have some things to share with you that might be hard to hear, but I want you to know that I care. The third aspect of credibility for Aristotle was logos. And the logos question is, do you know what you're talking about? I need to know that you've thought this through, that you've encountered people like me, that you understand why I'm asking the question, that you understand something about my story, and that your answer can be put into some kind of a context, a reasonable faith. That's what they're wanting to know. So, ethos, pathos, logos help develop that base of credibility. But the second part is conversation. I'd like to share 6 ways to win hearts and minds, 6 conversational techniques, I guess, if you will, that help bridge the gap between generations. The first is to encourage feedback. To encourage feedback. When I'm in a tough conversation and I feel a little unsure, my response is, well, you need to read more. Here's a book that you need to read, or here are the arguments about this. And uh, but important to Gen Z and to the millennial generation is to have conversation about it. So I will encourage feedback. I'll say to a student, why don't you take this argument to your friends and get their feedback and see if they have any good responses to share with me? I know that if I can get somebody to talk about with other people what we are discussing, then it goes deeper into their heart and into their mind. It also was a little safer of a way to do it. As a father of 4 children, I learned early on that if I ask my child, "Hey, what do you think about some issue, critical race theory or something like that?" They might say, "Oh, I don't really think about it very much," or shrug their shoulders. They don't really want to engage in the conversation. But if I ask, "Does this ever come up at your school? And if so, how do people think about it?" One time I took a couple of my children out to dinner. I said, I'm going to be doing a presentation on how to reach the hearts and minds of the millennial and Gen Z generations. What are some of the points that you think I should emphasize? And they were able to give me some really good feedback on that. It turns out that encouraging feedback is a very persuasive act. In fact, studies in persuasion have shown that people are more likely to embrace what you are talking about if they have the opportunity to receive and give feedback than if they believe that the argument itself is persuasive. That's the power of human communication. The second thing that we're learning to do to encourage conversation is don't be discouraged by resistance. Um, I can think back in times of my life where the things I said to adults who are around me might have discouraged them that I would ever grow up to be a person of faith. But the resistance is not necessarily a bad thing. Iron sharpens iron. I will share with my students, thinking this through makes both of us stronger. The goal is to recognize that people don't resist change per se. What they resist is a loss of status, a loss of a feeling of dignity. So there's always that going on behind the scenes. My brother, who is a pastor, said, we have to deal with a lot of conflicts between people in the church. And he said, this one thing I am sure of, what it's about is almost never what it's about. There's something below the surface that if we don't address, will foreclose the possibility of a resolution. So the resistance is not necessarily bad. It can be a good thing. Third is to avoid creating unsolvable fear. At Summit Ministries, we have to address a lot of things that are really challenging conflicts for our cultural context. We have to bring up the fact that there are really hard things happening, and there is an awful lot at stake in how we have these conversations and resolve these issues. Sometimes students can be overcome with fear. And you can imagine, most of our students are headed off to the university. They know that as a Christian, they'll be standing alone, and they don't really like that. It creates a lot of fear, creates a lot of anxiety. But I've also realized that I cannot motivate them by amping up that fear. That's a common technique. Advertisers use it all of the time. Create fear so that people are motivated to resolve the cognitive dissonance. But you have to be so careful with this. Years ago, I remember the nuclear freeze movement, and it was a scary time. If nuclear bombs go off, it could end life as we know it. And there was a group of people called the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they actually put out reports detailing exactly what the human and environmental impact of a nuclear war would be. It was horrifying to read these reports, literally terrifying, nightmare-inducing material. And they thought, surely if people can see the full impact of this, they'll be motivated to do something. That group found out counterintuitively that that's not what occurred. What occurred, rather, is that people fell into a state that psychologists call psychic numbing. They became so overwhelmed with fear that they just shut down and didn't have the difficult conversations about resolving the issue. So I want to always communicate to our students, I am concerned about what is happening in our country, but we are not helpless. Don't want to create unsolvable fear. Fourth, and this may also be counterintuitive, is to ask for things. Our instinct here is to say, could I take you to coffee and hear your perspective and share mine? That's asking for something. I'll even ask students for a decision. Say, well, we've discussed this issue for a while. I'd really like to hear how you've resolved it. Do you find persuasive what we've talked about at all? Is this something that you believe that you could live out, that you could articulate? You see, I'm recognizing that merely chatting about something isn't ultimately helpful. We need to change as people. So I'm asking for things. Sometimes just the act of asking for things brings about change. Robert Cialdini is a professor here in the States who studies persuasion. One time he did a study in a major city where he had his researchers fan out through the city, randomly approach people and ask them, would you be willing to chaperone a group of juvenile detention center inmates for 2 hours on a trip to the zoo? Most people said no. as you might expect. In fact, 83% of people said no. It is fairly remarkable that 17% of people randomly approached with that kind of a question said yes, but it was just 17%. Then they did a second phase of the study. The researchers fanned throughout the city and asked this question: would you be willing to be a mentor 2 hours every week, unpaid, for inmates at the juvenile detention center for 2 years? Not a single person said yes, as you might expect. Then the researcher asked, okay, if you aren't willing to do that, would you be willing to chaperone a group of juvenile detention center inmates on a 2-hour trip to the zoo? Incredibly, 50% of the people said yes. That's 3 times as many as in the previous study. The researchers concluded that if you make a big ask, people may not go all the way there with you, but they will be more likely to agree to other things along the way. So ask for things. Fifth, offer a way to be consistent. I think we're involved in a worldwide experiment as humanity to see if we can live without God. And lots of people think that God conversations are irrelevant to what's really important. And yet, we have young adults today with the highest levels of anxiety ever recorded, the highest levels of depression ever recorded, the highest levels of purposelessness ever recorded, the highest levels of hopelessness, feelings of hopelessness ever recorded, and very high levels of fear and shame. People still deal with the consequences of sin, even if they will argue to you that there is no such thing as sin or that the idea of sin is antiquated. So I'm always wanting to ask students or offer them a way to be consistent. Wouldn't it be great to know that we could live without fear or shame? Because I have to go beyond what they're saying with their mouths to what I know they're dealing with in their hearts. A sixth point is to be likable, to express confidence. I have confidence in you to think this through and make a good decision. If a student says to me, I just don't see how anyone could possibly believe that the Bible is true. Say, well, let me give you some reasons that you might consider. Maybe you can take these back to some of your friends and see what they think. They might think that I'm completely crazy. You might think that I'm completely crazy. But would you be willing to do that? Would you be willing to have a real good conversation about this? And then just to say along the way, listen, we may have a lot of disagreements here, but I have confidence in you to think this through and to make a good decision. So let's keep the conversation going. Being likable is so significant in this process. So those are those are 6 points that we have found really help open up conversations between generations. And I told you there would be 6, but here's a bonus point. We'll call it 6.5. Keep your mood positive. I'm smiling because a few years ago, I was asked by a group uh, of women who were involved in trying to have an influence on public policy decision making in Washington, D.C. They were advocating for all kinds of issues. And they said to me, listen, you're a communications professor. We really need some help because we can't connect with the next generation. We're trying to pass the baton to young women to join us, but they aren't interested. So I went to meet with this group, and I found that they were so overcome with stress at all of the issues they were trying to deal with that they had become, at least in my observation, bitter and cynical and sarcastic. They were no fun to be around at all. And I thought to myself, I think I know exactly why you can't get young women to join you, because they're looking at you with this stressed, bitter, cynical, hopeless perspective. And they're thinking, I don't really want to be like that. I don't want to be in your group. This particular group did change course and started a young women's organization to empower young women to do things like stand for pro-life. But they instead of focusing on how bad things are in the world and how awful it is that our legislators aren't taking us seriously, they focused on empowering young women that, you can take a stand. What you do makes a difference. And you have power as a woman to be able to speak into these issues. That was a message that young women really embraced, and they have been able to form campus chapters on university campuses all around the country because of their um, very different and much more positive attitude. I'd like to tell you a quick story. I know I risk running over time here as I do this, but here is an example of the kind of young person I'm talking about. Haley McNamara is the director of the International Center on Sexual Exploitation and the vice president of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Haley came to our program, learned a biblical worldview, learned some of these conversation techniques, and she has been able to address the issue of pornography. In the past, when somebody might go to a corporation and say, your corporation, Google, for example, is enabling the distribution of pornography, the company might say, well, look, you're just trying to impose your morality on us. You're a Christian and that's fine for you, but don't tell us what to do. Haley, on the other hand, took a conversational approach and has been able to make a tremendous difference. She recently, for example, went to Instagram and said, uh, you are allowing adults who are unknown to these children, even if they have their privacy settings, to contact children. And she said, do you know how long it takes an adult predator to cultivate a young person for sexual exploitation? 20 minutes on average. Then she brought some young women along with her to say, here are young women who've been victimized because of the policies that your company has that you could change. Instagram changed their policies to prevent random adults from being able to reach out to young people. Same thing happened at TikTok. She was able to get Google Play to stop allowing access to apps that are pornographic, to stop advertising through Google Ads for websites that are pornographic. She was even able to get hotel rooms across the country to stop offering on demand pornography in their rooms just by presenting what's really going on and doing it in a conversational way, never avoiding the tough issues, never avoiding the truth, but always intertwining truth and relationship. And I asked Haley, I interviewed her for my podcast last week, and she said, keep in mind, these people are parents too. They are concerned about the way things are going, and they want to have a resolution for many of these difficult issues as well. So I just love stories like that because I see that we can make a difference for this generation. We would love to have the young adults you know and love join us for one of our in-person 2-week sessions. I do understand that with all the COVID issues and passports and the difficulty of getting visas, that might not be possible. But at summit.org, you'll see that we also offer a 1-week virtual program. Last summer, students participated in this program from 45 different countries, and we would welcome the young adults you know and love to participate with us in one of these programs as well. You can see more information at the summit.org website. If you're interested in books for yourself, we also have a library of books available for offer, along with lots of videos and articles and things like that. If you just go to the summit.org website, you'll be able to see all of that information.